got it. Thanks, James.
Thank you.
So today we'll be talking about these specific neighborhoods. We want to hear from you about what's important. We'll share some information about what's at risk in this neighborhood. And we want to talk with you about what are some possible actions that we've identified in these 3 scenarios that include sort of ideas on how those areas might change and how they could be more resilient through a mix of both physical and non-physical solutions. We'll share some key considerations about those strategies and really want to hear from you about what you think about them. We want to hear more from you about what is the most important thing to advance. And we also want to hear from you about things that we share that you would not want to happen. And, you know, I think we've been using this analogy a lot, but we have the tools and ideas like a carpenter, but this is really your house. And we want to make sure that the strategies that we're developing meet the priorities and the needs that you know about in your own communities. So I'll start with a little bit of area context. In downtown, this is really the commercial center of the city. It's home of many city buildings, arts and cultural centers like the Prudential Center, the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. There's also some neighborhood parks, various academic institutions. NJIT is here, Rutgers Newark, Essex Community Council, Community College. And you know, these are all sort of big institutions that could also be partners and some key players in the implementation of solutions. The area is also a regional transportation center with Newark Penn Station, Broad Street Station, with the PATH train, Jersey Transit, and also buses. There's also the state highway and interstate highway running along the borders of the area. So many places that are really important to the economy of Newark and also the wider region, critical transportation, infrastructure for mobility. And that's something that we've really heard about in our outreach thus far that people really value about living in Newark. There's also some beloved parks that we've heard about in this area: Lincoln Park, Jesse Allen Park, Military Park. And a key theme of the feedback we've received so far is that increasing access to parks and green space like this is something that people want to see. The area north of downtown, it's more residential area, but with some industrial properties bordering the river. We've heard that these industrial properties really do limit public access to the Passaic River, and that increasing access to the waterfront is something that people would like to see more of. There's residential areas here that are adjacent to Branch Brook Park. We've heard about for many as one of the Newarkers' favorite places. These neighborhoods do have some more green space and more trees than some other areas in Newark. There's also many historic properties like the Forest Hill Historic District that have been preserved. So before we move on, is there anything outside of what I shared that people want to add on to or supplement in any way?
I'll just flag for Erica that now that you're looking at the map a little bit more close up, you can decide if you want to be in the other breakout room.
I think I'm good here. Thanks, Nat.
All right, great.
I'll just say that along this screen that we have right here, I think the lack of really nice quality park space is actually one of the major comments that the city receives. And I know that Trust for Public Land Scott's here, so he can talk about some of the projects that he's working on in partnership with schools and whatnot, but it's certainly a big need in this part of the city, parks access.
Do that now or later, or?
I just wanted to flag that. I don't know if folks know that you're with the Trust Public Land and you're working on a project here, so you can if you want. This is more of a conversation style, so please, feel free to pipe up now if that's helpful.
Sure. I mean, I'll just do a quick thing. There's a school, Luis Munoz Marin Elementary School. It's just north of the cemetery on Broadway, and we're working with that school currently and looking at their playground to sort of do some things there, and absolutely will be including green infrastructure and that discussion and thinking. But then also there's 2 acres of right now vacant property right next to the school, immediately north of the school, that's has a name, Broadway Park, but it's not really a park at this point. So someday it will be, and we're working with the city on making that a park. So, and there'll be outreach to the community around that when we are ready to, in a position to start that design process and things. So.
So we want to capture all of those planned and existing activities in the action plan. I don't know, Mary or Travis or James, if those two, Broadway Park as a sort of a massive improvement opportunity, and the Luis Munoz Marin School green infrastructure is in our action plan, but it'd be good to capture that as a planned activity.
Definitely.
I
Yeah, we can
might
make
have
sure to-
shared that before with the group, but maybe.
Oh,
maybe
good. So
not.
then maybe they have it already, and it's
Might
just
be in
this
there.
is at this scale, it's hard to see.
Right.
We'll double check.
Yeah, I noted it
Definitely
down
worth
just in case.
Great.
All right, well, great. Well, so next we'll walk through some of the results of the flood models for this area, and actually I'll turn it over to Travis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Travis, architect and planner and part of this consultant team. I'll talk a little bit about the risks, and then through the rest of the presentation, Mary and I will tag team back and forth between some of the physical and non-physical elements of the scenarios. So you saw Natalie present the overall Newark flood map earlier in the large group, where coastal flooding, sandy type flooding is a much bigger concern. Where we are here in downtown in the Upper Passaic, you can say that coastal flooding is looking to be much less of a concern, particularly in the downtown. And flooding from rain is our major hazard here, as you can see with the big kind of major pond in the middle of downtown. And if we move just a little bit north to the next slide. There we go. So as we move north into the Upper Passaic, the flood risk from the rain is still there on specific streets and some low-lying areas. We have a row of industrial properties along the Passaic River that are in the coastal floodplain, or the riverine floodplain in this case. And that red line there, if you can see it, I know it's a little small scale, but that red line represents where we anticipate high tide to be in 50 years from now. So starting to eat away at that first block of buildings and properties. So if we go to the next slide. As Natalie introduced in
Oh,
the big
Travis,
group.
can we go back one?
Oh, yes, sure.
You didn't really talk about Clay Street all that much, and that's like a major flooding concern for the city. So I just wanted to point out that it's like one of the areas that we experience quite a lot of traffic impacts. So I didn't really hear you talk about that, so I wanted to make sure to name it.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, and we'll talk about when in the later scenarios, the types of interventions that we're looking at specifically related to roadway flooding. So thank you for highlighting that. So the team has tried to organize and group potential actions into these three scenarios. And as Natalie presented earlier, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Some can build on each other, and ultimately what we want to have at the end of this process is a hybrid that kind of takes the best pieces of each of these. But moving from left to right, the first scenario kind of looks at the things that are within the current wheelhouse of individuals, of government entities, and so forth, and in some cases actually taking existing efforts that are already underway and just trying to expand them, extend them, and build upon them. In a way, this is the most low-hanging fruit, if you will. So we're not really asking anybody to act out of their comfort zones or have to coordinate across agencies or public-private partnerships. It's really what can individual entities do within their current paradigm. In scenario 2, we start to get a little bit out of our, yeah, there we go. Scenario 2, what we're calling shared responsibility, is when we start to look for opportunistically about overlaps where neighbors and different city entities, public and private entities, can start to partner with each other in order to have a greater impact. And then scenario 3, we start to look at things that are bigger really than just this neighborhood, potentially bigger than just Newark, larger, more multi-function projects that would take more coordination, would take going out of a comfort zone, changing the paradigm somewhat, but ultimately bringing greater multifunction benefit to the communities of Northeastern New Jersey. And I have a note here that I make a reminder to everyone that as even though Mary and I are going to be presenting a number of slides here, as Natalie said earlier, this is really meant to be a conversation. So even while we're talking, feel free to use the chat function to layer in thoughts, questions, and we'll try to have a little bit of a loose format going back and forth between us talking and you all talking. So I think the best way to really explain these scenarios is start to actually look at them within the neighborhoods, which is what we're going to do next. So first, kind of a toolkit of the type of projects that we're talking about in scenario 1, the kind of individual initiative. These tend to be smaller, focused, monofunction, singular function projects. So it might be doing a rain garden or like number 4 here, doing some localized green infrastructure in a particular street that floods a lot. Both 4 and 6 showing examples of that. It might be a private property owner or even a government property owner changing a hard parking lot service to a permeable one to help improve drainage. It could be barriers placed around critical buildings, electrical substations and so forth on a single property or along the water where there's a continuous right-of-way or land ownership. A single entity could endeavor to do some bulkhead raising to protect against higher levels of water in the future. And on the next slide, we're going to go into downtown, I think, and look at how some of these scenario 1 solutions start to map themselves out within the neighborhood. So as we said before, this idea of looking at what type of efforts that are already underway and seeing ways that we might extend them. So that orange line represents the riverfront park bulkhead raising that is already starting to happen at the corner of our downtown site. So one thing that we might do in this scenario is look to continue that project further to the north and further to the North Passaic neighborhood as well. Additionally, another effort that we know is in the planning stages right now is for the LTCP parallel interceptor, which is that bluish teal line running next to the Passaic River and then continuing on to the southeast.
I just want to translate a tiny bit, Travis, for folks that
Yes.
aren't tracking the long-term control plan, which is
Yes.
what LTCP stands for. The city of Newark has a 30-year plan for managing pollution that makes it into our water bodies. And as part of that, there's an intention to basically dig up underneath 21 McCarter Highway and create a new piping system that can capture the rainwater that's currently like hitting the streets and overwhelming our sewer system. So essentially to add capacity to our sewer system, and that's called the parallel interceptor.
And so essentially there is this big investment that is already planned for improving regional drainage. And what we're showing here in those lighter blue lines is, well, let's take advantage of this big investment that's happening with smaller investments in localized drainage improvements that can feed into that bigger project, feed into that big pipe, and thereby leverage those investments that are already happening. Here we also note those green squares by that number 2, showing how some individual properties, whether privately owned or government owned, could individually start to retain water on their own sites. And if we go to the next slide, we can see a little bit how things look north along the Passaic. See here in that orange line, again, continuing up, extending that riverfront park. The reason that it stops there is because we are, in this scenario, utilizing, as we said, the low-hanging fruit, for a government project, areas that the government already controls. Properties to the north are a mix of different landowners. So in this scenario, we stop when it gets a little bit too tough from the coordination angle. Now, the project that Natalie hopefully explained for the parallel interceptor actually is intended to help with a lot of the drainage issues in this neighborhood. We show a couple of small improvements, but I think a lot of the modeling is showing that that interceptor project should go a long way to improving drainage in this neighborhood. Although we are showing with that green line down the middle and a couple others there, some localized ideas of utilizing green infrastructure improvements in some of the major right-of-ways. We've also, on both of these slides, have noted a couple of these non-physical solutions with the black dots and the white numbers. And so these are policy-based interventions, sometimes relating to a specific area and sometimes relating to the whole neighborhood. And I believe Mary's going to talk about that on the next slide. But before we go there, we'll note that we also, in both of these neighborhood areas, are showing these little orange triangles. And the idea of these is a kind of community resilience hub. So some sort of facility where people can come together and get more information about how to protect their homes, livelihoods, get information on flood risks and these sorts of things. And Mary can talk a bit about the kind of programming of those as well in the non-physical chapter we're going to jump into next. Oh, sorry, I have one more slide. So we talked through in the two neighborhoods, the two sub-neighborhoods, the different types of projects that we might do related to coastal protection, related to drainage improvements, related to green infrastructure. And in each scenario, you're going to see this slide again, but basically we break down what that project might mean from a cost standpoint, from an implementation standpoint, but also from a protection and co-benefit standpoint. And in each of these cases, any potential project, any potential collection of projects, we really want to think about the trade-offs. So for instance, extending that coastal park would increase protection, hopefully would also improve some quality of life in terms of adding additional green space and so forth. But by raising the edge, you necessarily affect and complicate people's access to the waterfront. So these are trade-offs that even an ostensibly great project has to consider. Similarly with the drainage system, the positive side, upgrades to the current system could be phased so that we can facilitate construction while also providing immediate benefit in certain areas. However, the kind of upgrades we're talking about here to the existing system won't greatly expand the existing sewer capacity. And by simply collecting more water and putting it into the sewage system, then there's knock-on effects down the way where we have to think about overall capacity for how we treat all that additional water that we're putting into the system. So that's why we also want to think about green infrastructure projects that could potentially limit the amount of water, slow down the amount of water that goes into the wastewater treatment system. But as a trade-off, there's only so much space in the right-of-way, and putting in a green infrastructure, bioswale, rain garden, these things compete with other interests of how we use that right-of-way space. So often putting in a green infrastructure implementation may mean the reduction in parking spaces. And so we need to always be considering these different types of trade-offs. So next slide. Mary.
All right, great. Thanks, Travis. So while those physical and structural solutions we just talked about are really important for keeping water out or giving it places to go, we're also looking at a range of other non-physical solutions that are also necessary in addition to the physical side. These can be things that allow us to be able to adapt and respond to flooding. It can be also policies or programs that can help shift the way that development or other projects take place so they are more resilient. And we've grouped these into these 4 categories: things related to outreach and education, policy and governance, new services or programs, and emergency response and preparedness. There's a lot of different solutions you can see on this slide that we're looking at, so we'll just touch on a few, and we'll be making these slides available to you to take a closer look afterwards as well. And also to say that this 4th category of emergency response and preparedness is something that we're still sort of exploring. We're working on having conversations with some local and state emergency managers, and we'll have more to say about at our next meeting. So within scenario 1, I want to highlight some things that the city of Newark can lead mostly on its own, starting with promoting and incorporating. Oh, thanks. Slides are online now. Something the city of Newark can lead on its own would be promoting and incorporating resident flood reporting. This refers to having a system in place to use community knowledge about where flooding is happening in real time to be able to guide the city's response and improve understanding of localized flooding. Newark actually, as we've heard, has already created a website where you can report flooding and is going to continue promoting that site so more people know how to use it. Also, Newark and other cities in the area have local policies or ordinances that set requirements for developers or construction in the regulated flood areas on how to manage their stormwater. And so one of the strategies that we're looking at here is for the city to adopt stricter standards through the ordinances that would restrict certain uses in flood areas. They could require more developments to store stormwater on site and do things like requiring the disclosure of past flooding when selling the home. And then another issue that we've heard a lot about is with trash building up in streets and clogging catch basins. This makes it hard for stormwater to enter the drainage system. And some solutions that we've talked about could be expanding the Adopt a Catch Basin program, which provides a kit and guidance to Newark residents to clean up trash from particularly problematic catch basins. Also a waste reduction campaign that could involve outreach and education to help people understand the importance of trash in causing flooding and other problems. And then just another concept to highlight from this slide is the idea of a municipal stormwater utility. It's a relatively new concept in New Jersey, but it allows local governments to establish a utility to collect fees from properties based off of their amount of impervious surfaces and amount of stormwater that they contribute to the system. So this allows the city to hold developments that contribute the most to flooding to be financially responsible for it, which is something that Newark and other cities in the region are looking into. Some of these other solutions like the Flood Management 101 campaign, Outreach Ambassador Program, Resilience Hubs, tree plantings, those are some things that we can focus more on in scenarios 2 or 3, but welcome any feedback on those ideas now too.
Can I maybe just take a pause and ask for some of the folks that have joined this session? You know, we're scheduled till 5:30, so we've got another 25 minutes or so, and we'll talk about more sort of scenarios, but just, this is supposedly the easiest because you don't have to talk to that many other people to make it happen. Do folks feel like some of these ideas would help to address the flooding issues that you see in your neighborhoods?
I guess I'll hop in real quick. Some of the things I realized with flooding in the downtown area. Hi everyone, this is John Gordon. I live downtown and I'm also the city's climate action coordinator. Is when I'm walking downtown, I find a few intersections, like where the drain is, there's a lot of puddling or like flooding in front of the walkways. You know what I mean by that? Like if I'm walking through a crosswalk, the crosswalk's flooded. So like, and if you look at it, it makes sense if it was you know, designed for a car, like on Broad Street. You don't want a lot of water on Broad Street, but it's okay to have a lot of water on the off streets. Does that make sense? So like for a pedestrian, it's a struggle.
And it does reflect the priorities of when these streets were designed.
Yeah.
So this is exactly the type of thing that we're talking about that would be within the wheelhouse of the transportation agency to improve localized flooding within this scenario by changing the contours and the section profiles of these streets and where water goes. And
you know, I was so excited about tonight's meeting. I decided to walk home or walk back from NJIT to downtown, and in the rain. It was interesting because even though it was a short walk, maybe like 10-15 minutes, not even, as I was walking around the campus that had taller buildings around it, but not as wide roads, the wind wasn't as bad. But as soon as I got to like the larger streets, my umbrella was like, oh, you were not ready for this. And then so I cut down into the alleyways in between the broader streets, and I didn't realize how much the wind was going to be even stronger. So the water was definitely one thing, but the wind was a whole nother situation that I don't even know how you would even start to incorporate into that. And also an additional note, you know, I know sometimes, like, say if I was out somewhere during the day and I didn't know that it was going to be raining or something, when coming back into town, really the only entryways into the city, like coming from the south, whatnot, are always extremely flooded, like during a rain event. It could be any rain event. So that's also like an inconvenience or a possible situation where your property could get damaged when you live downtown, but having to drive through other parts.
Can I just flag that as our climate action coordinator, John is spending a lot of time thinking about our strategy to transition our fleets to electric vehicles, and electric vehicles cannot go through standing water. So it's just something to point out to sort of reinforce the comment that you were making, Travis, about the roadway sort of improvements. Are you suggesting that the change would be not only drainage improvement, but like surface regrading, essentially, to have the water not puddle at the corners?
So what's interesting about these types of studies, and fortunately we don't have one of our Arcadis drainage engineers in this breakout room, but generally when the hydrologists run the models, they kind of assume anything under, say, like 6 or 8 inches of standing water is acceptable flooding from a risk reduction standpoint. When you're talking about major property damage and so forth. But what's interesting and what's being brought up here is that obviously, even if it's a smaller amount of flooding, but if it's standing water, what we call nuisance flooding, that has a negative impact on quality of life and potentially economic disruption and so forth, even if it's not enough water to make physical damages. And so I'd say, as part of this stakeholder engagement, I think it's a note that we should make that this is something that should be considered too. But yes, Natalie, to your question is, by redesigning the streetscapes and some of those smaller green infrastructure, bioswale type interventions, they can help with this type of local nuisance flooding, because in doing that project, you basically completely change the contour, the section of the roadway that you're working within.
Okay.
So that's a
for that.
co-benefit that you can get.
Before we move away from this strategy, I'd particularly like to pick Scott and Nana's brain about this idea of putting green infrastructure in parks and open spaces. Nana, as an athlete who, you know, a lot of, there's this idea that resilience parks are a really attractive way to go, because you're not playing, you know, softball in the rain usually, and therefore if it's wet it'll dry out before the next game or something like that. And Scott, I'm sure you've put a lot of thought into how this looks. I know that, you know, we've had conversations about how our turfs are urban heat islands in the city of Newark and so on and so forth. Just curious for your perspective on this idea of subsurface storage at parks.
Is it Nana? I'll let her go first if she wants.
Nana, do you wanna share some thoughts there?
Yeah, I totally agree with John in regards to the flooding and like the parks and stuff. I feel as though like, cause some days cause like you said, I'm an athlete. So like some days I want to go out and play basketball, but I can't cause it's raining, or there'll be like many puddles in the park. So that'll get in the way a lot.
Yeah, for us, I mean, obviously, you know, first thing we want to look at is drainage in the park, right? So we want to make sure that the park is well drained and well, you know, so it can dry out more quickly when it's ready and people are ready to get back outside. It's a great opportunity, you know, and you know, because there isn't a building on the site per se with the foundation and all that, we have a lot of places that we can do that. We can do that with rain gardens. We can do that with what we do a lot, and what we're doing in Jesse Allen Park right now is a store and release system underneath the playing field. So that's you know, there's lots of interesting opportunities to do that. Other places, other cities, right, use parks as a receiving site for stormwater, you know, from nearby areas around the park. Something to think about, you know, you don't want to overburden the park with so much additional, you know, a lot of the parks here in Newark are not that big, you know, so there isn't so much space to deal with that you can just allocate it to a rain garden or something like that. So I'd be cautious about how much we could additionally add to the parks, you know, what the parks can do, but the parks themselves can certainly do a great job of handling their own stormwater, especially the athletic fields, playing fields, the paved areas, you know, basketball courts and stuff like that. Make sure that those are drained and handled on site, you know, as best as possible. And that's something that we try to do. And schoolyards, same thing. I mean, we have a opportunity to sort of change the paved schoolyards to, you know, depave chunks of them, you know, make them gardens, make them planted, but then also take the opportunity to put some green infrastructure underneath them and handle the stormwater there as well. I think, you know, each site has a great opportunity. And then if you think of these sites collectively across the city, you can really make an impact. I think if you sort of added that all up across the city, and I think that's something really worth looking for, like the municipal sewer authority, that would be something that we'd want to look at, like as opportunity zones for handling some of the stormwater across the city.
Thanks, Scott. I think that is a great segue to the second scenario, where we start to look beyond the confines of the existing parks and start to think about expanding the purview and expanding where we have public open space and drainage infrastructure working together. And so these typologies in the second scenario, they're a bit more opportunistic, like you're describing, Scott. So taking up a little bit more space, but requiring coordination between adjacent uses and property owners and so forth, and starting to look like, I think that you mentioned earlier before, the Broadway Park, that's not a park yet. So looking at zones where we can expand into and change uses through collaborative ventures. And so a number of these solutions, like the extended Riverwalk, or number 3 and number 5 here, is larger spaces for stormwater detention and green infrastructure that uses both private and public lands, linking together adjacent properties, is one way that we think about the sort of things that we can do in scenario 2. Others are these larger infrastructure projects that just simply by their scale require coordination across multiple property owners and multiple agencies, like this deep tunnel stormwater conveyance. So Natalie was explaining a little bit before about the large interceptor project. I don't think it's going to be quite that big, but you get an idea of the scale of these types of projects that go underground to improve drainage infrastructure.
What strikes me about this slide too is that these are like super expensive projects, and often you need all the coordination from various agencies to be able to pull off things like this, but the benefit in terms of cost avoided is spread out. And so from like an education and coordinations perspective, convincing people that it's worth working together for something where you're only going to recoup like some of the cost is a big education piece, I think, in this.
And we start in this scenario to think a little bit about opening up different co-benefits and multiple funding opportunities. Because obviously if you combine a drainage project with a transit project, that's potentially 2 different sources of funding that can come together. So we start to crack open that can a little bit in scenario 2, but we blow it all the way open in scenario 3, which hopefully we have enough time to get to. But for now, James, let's jump into the maps. So downtown, not a whole lot changes in this scenario for downtown. I think potentially more private properties could come into the mix in public-private partnerships and so forth. There's can be some additional expansion to drainage infrastructure and looking at doing things that cross different agencies' purviews. But I think where we really start to see the differences in the northern map, where in scenario 1, we said it's too hard to deal with all of these different industrial property owners. But in scenario 2, the shared responsibility and looking at adjacencies and working together, that maybe there's a way for the city to coordinate with these different property owners to create a easement that would allow this riverfront park to continue all the way to the north, protecting the neighborhoods behind it, bringing more open space, but there's benefits also for those private property owners who would now, their properties that were very flood prone before are now on the dry side of the flood protection. And so I think in the interest of time, we can jump to the next slide here. So again, we start to look at the trade-offs between different types of maneuvers, as I was mentioning on the last slide. Extending that raised coastal park would bring a lot of benefits, but also would require that level of coordination. I think, Natalie, you're asking, I'm sorry, it just like flashes by and then disappears. But you were asking how we would envision a project like that, Natalie?
Yeah, I was just really struck by 2.5 feet of sea level rise, new coastline being exactly sort of where we're thinking about extending the walkway and what that means in terms of creating that protection for those adjacent property owners. I think you would have to be building, you know, I mean, we did some of this with Riverfront Park, and Scott can speak to that as well, where while we were building that park, we built it at a higher than sandy elevation, but nobody knows that because it's sort of buried and imaginary, as it were. But the idea of those added costs, Scott, if you can imagine, like Sandy happened before we went to Riverfront Park. If we're saying let's build it 3 feet higher for a 2070 scenario, that would be a really hard argument to make and a really important one to be able to show folks cost avoided under a future climate scenario.
And we were lucky at the riverfront that there were only some very, relatively speaking, some limited segments that needed that, you know, that additional sort of earthwork and sort of things installed, that we were able to sort of, you know, block some key points of where inland flooding could happen. But in some of these other locations upriver here, you know, it might be much longer stretches, which could be much more costly. Yeah.
Certainly, and you see on the little slider scale there that the costs and the permitting and the constructability of something like that become higher, but also the arguments and the need for coordination also get stronger, because you have a whole series of private property owners who, if nothing is done, their properties are going to be worthless because they're going to be underwater. And so that is an incentive to both coordinate, but potentially also share costs.
Absolutely. Yep. That's very.
Union of Concerned Scientists did some analysis on, you know, potential, you know, billions of dollars in Newark to build seawalls. I'll see if I can find that study because it was a really interesting analysis.
So I think,
yeah, I would just add too that like a lot of the bulkheads in that area are already really failing, and so there's really already like a need to do something along that shoreline just to deal with erosion. So, you know, I think there is a way of kind of like incorporating this additional elevation, additional resiliency into improvements that really already need to be made.
So I think that the discussion that we were just having about that extended Riverwalk Park really encapsulates the what types of projects we're talking about in scenario 2. Give one more example. This third one of green infrastructure here. So in scenario 1, we're talking about green infrastructure, water capture happening just within the public right-of-ways. And here we're saying, well, there's also all of these properties and buildings, and if you could incentivize folks to build blue roofs and green roofs, that could be a really big boon to the program. But the trade-off is then if you have to do the additional coordination and maintenance to connect those additional private systems into the broader public system. And then on the next slide, Mary can talk a little bit about some of the non-physical interventions that we would consider in this scenario.
Yeah, thanks. And just because I know we're running short on time, I'll be fast. You know, within scenario 2, it's really more of an emphasis on these non-physical strategies that rely on collaboration and coordination across groups, like community organizations, schools, or even individual residents. Through this Flood Management 101 campaign is one thing that came out directly out of feedback that we've heard about the importance of building education and awareness, something that could be done in partnership with schools and community groups to share information and build awareness about, you know, knowing people, knowing your risk and knowing what to do when there is a storm coming. Some other things would be like thinking about opportunities for how to implement green infrastructure on private properties. So things like tax incentive or grant programs, or even just having guidance to help individual homeowners know what types of things they should be looking at. And there's also this idea of a flood overlay zone. This is something that Jersey City has done. It requires properties in flood areas to install green infrastructure during redevelopment. So that's one thing to consider in this scenario. And then we've talked about a little bit about the idea of the resilience hubs as well, but and that's sort of something that would be in partnership with nonprofits to be managed.
Yeah, like for the resilience hub, by in the scenario one, that's something that's purely a municipal run entity, outlay, and so forth. But once we take on shared partnerships in scenario two, the city joining forces with a nonprofit, that could automatically expand the potential reach and impact that a resilience hub could have. So do we want to take a minute here for any additional thoughts before we go big with scenario three? All right, I think we already had a pretty good
Let's cram in these last 3 minutes and do what
Go
we
big.
can before 5:30, recognizing that this isn't the last time that we'll have this conversation with folks in Newark. So thank you for folks for listening.
So earlier, I think Natalie kind of foreshadowed where we could go with this kind of discussion about the type of larger kind of generational projects that are more than just being about flood protection, are more than just about short-term resiliency or nuisance flooding, but could have the potential to be super transformative, not just for Newark, not just for the neighborhood that we're looking at here today, but for the region. And these types of projects take money, they take time, but they take a supreme amount of coordination and often a kind of champion entity that helps coordinate across multiple municipalities and so forth. And in a way, this is kind of the thesis of the whole Resilient New Jersey program, is to start to think about what opportunities could open up if we think past our municipal borders. What are these larger projects that could improve our resiliency, but also improve our quality of life, and so forth. And here we have a couple examples of both larger engineering projects, but also these major greenways and parks that connect multiple neighborhoods and so forth. And in the interest of time, we can just kind of quickly show what this means. In these maps, it basically means a lot more green lines on the paper, more connectivity, more public investment, more cooperation between adjacent neighborhoods and cities. And maybe we just jump to the comments slide at the end so that we can talk through. Oh, sorry. There is a non-physical component that maybe Mary should touch on real quick before we go to comments.
Yeah, just quickly, I think, you know, in order to really realize these sorts of large infrastructure that crosses municipal boundaries, that has the kind of regional importance, you know, something that we've been exploring is what are the different types of, you know, of governance that is really needed at that scale that doesn't exist today in order to really move that forward. You know, something like building off of the Resilient Northeastern New Jersey program, maybe including, you know, even other municipalities in the area, but creating sort of more of a formal and ongoing regional coordinating body to really advance that coordination across municipal boundaries, be that sort of collective voice to argue for substantial investments that would be needed to really see this through. And that's, yeah, that's really kind of the idea behind scenario 3 on the non-physical side, is the types of governance that would be needed to make that happen.
And Mary, while we're here, I think this is maybe a good slide to answer the question that come up in the chat about what's the community's role in this, and how are they involved?
I can take the first crack at that. Thank you so much for posing the question, because at least from my perspective as, as a city official, where I see it happening is at various points of the process. There's a point in the process where we're trying to get money from the federal agencies, where we're just conceiving of things basically at our desks and coming up with ideas and then trying to get money in the door so that we can actually do the work. And at that stage, there's relatively little community involvement, if I'm honest. You have to kind of get the resources to be able to do the projects, then have the funding on hand to be able to do the very deep community conversations. When it comes to our planning conversations, that's very community involved. So this is an example of that. We'll have more of these Newark only resilient NJ meetings. Our first one was virtual and covers the entire city, but the intention is to have these very hyper-local community meetings, like what we're having in a breakout in person for the study areas in Newark. And then beyond that, there's a lot of the things that are in the plan as ideas would then be followed up with very specific community meetings for this type of strategy. So our green infrastructure strategy has high degree of community and stakeholder engagement, so that, like, I'll give you an idea. We're trying to put a green garden in front of Cityplex, in front of the movie theater. And so there's lots of community conversation happening as part of that, just to kind of get to the point where we could coordinate with all of those stakeholders and then let people know what's happening, because a lot of people don't know what a rain garden is, don't know if they want it, don't know how it's going to affect, their day-to-day commute. Not sure if that directly answers all your questions, but yeah, Cityflex is in your neighborhood. I'm really glad to hear that. So I would be more than happy to follow up with you on that, but if you want to unmute yourself and sort of share a little bit more. This would be a 50-year plan, and the master plan is a 10-year plan. Go ahead. Is it Delia?
Yes, it is Delia. Good night, everyone. As my question says, in theory, it is to involve the community. The people that live here, they're the ones that, in theory, should be benefiting from any development and stuff that is going on in the community. And I understood everything that you say. It's a 50-year plan that you stated at the end, correct?
That's right. I'm sorry, I'm nodding. So yes, because I was muted. So yes, it's an outlook of 50 years, but we're trying to do, obviously we're flooding now, right? Like our neighborhoods have challenges right now. So we're trying to identify the early action projects and try and get those funded and started as soon as possible. But in addition to that, we need to, plan for today and for the future. So it's a sort of a both and strategy.
And you could, let tag on real quick. You could see also these scenario 1, 2, and 3 as roughly corresponding to short-term, medium-term, and long-term investments that the city and the region could make. So the type of things that we're talking about in scenario 1 are probably going to be the ones that end up in the final recommendations as the things to prioritize funding for right away.
I do understand, as a Newark resident, a homeowner, and I do understand, yes, you have to get the funding first, then the planning stage. I just don't want local Newarkers, especially small business owners like myself, to be left out, to end up on the outside looking in like, okay, all this money is going through my community and I can't even get, to participate in, getting my opportunity, so to speak, and other people like myself.
I'm really grateful you flagged that, because I'm curious, one of the things that I remember when the city was considering our own plastic bag ban before the state passed one, that we had a really hard time figuring out even what time to schedule meetings for business owners, because some folks are really busy during the day, some folks are really busy at night. And so there was folks going just to in person to hand out flyers and to have conversations and whatnot. But can I just ask you, specifically for yourself, and I'll ask Erica this as well, because her family owns a grocery store, and so I know that you guys are also small business owners. What works best to get the word out to small business owners, other than a letter from the city to whoever owns the parcel, which doesn't necessarily get to the day-to-day operators of a given site?
Yeah, that is true. I'm fortunate in that aspect that I am self-employed. I'm a photographer, I'm a notary, I'm a graphic artist. So I have a lot of time flexibility and I schedule my days. Everyone is not as fortunate, but some people like this virtual meeting. This is great. It's just getting the word out more. I'm signed up with the city of Newark. So everything that happens, if rain is gonna fall, I get a call, a text message, and an email. It's just getting the word out more about the city of Newark so more people know about it. A lot of people don't know. When I told my friend about it, who was just calling my mobile, she's like, they do that? Yes, they do every week. So it's just, you just have to figure out a way to put up billboards. There's billboards, so people pass it, they can't ignore it.
Yeah, we're gonna have some
Mailers.
bus ads as part of this campaign for Resilient NJ, but you're right. I mean, really diversifying the strategy. I was on the phone with someone today who saw the NJ.com article and I told him, oh, we're having a meeting, it's on Zoom. And he was like, yeah, absolutely not. I'm not joining a Zoom meeting. Next time, like, give me a call when you're ready for the in-person meetings, because he just would not. And he lives in a super flood affected neighborhood, but he was not interested in joining a call or logging into Facebook Live.
You could diversify the meeting. Yes, it can be on Zoom, but it could also have a community hall meeting at the same time. So everyone meets on the level that they can appreciate, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. And I appreciate folks going over time a little bit. I'm cool to stay for another 5 minutes or so if my fellow facilitators are as well. Eric, I see your hand.
Eric, okay.
I'm sorry, giving back the floor.
You're good, thank you. Go ahead, Erica.
Oh no, you're super good. I think that's great that you brought up that really important point, because as Natalie said, my family, we own one of the grocery stores here in Newark, specifically near the Clay Street area on the 7th Avenue in the North Ward of Newark, Central Ward of Newark, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting that now, I'm Central Ward after realizing that. So the one thing that I wanted to say to you, Natalie, is you said that how could you reach more engagement with business owners, especially specifically like grocery store owners? And I would say for us particularly, what would be super helpful is coming to the stores themselves and speaking to folks. I know that requires a lot of more hands-on work and requires more boots on the ground, that sort of thing. But I know, like, for my partner, he's just not going to attend a Zoom meeting. Maybe like what the person earlier mentioned, having the meetings. Give me 1 second, just 1 second. Maybe having the meetings so that way they're at the same time, and having them virtual and also in person, and then just having one big screen so that way everyone's heard. That's a really good idea. Or just maybe having in-person meetings at another time. But I do know for us, Zoom meetings just doesn't work for him and a lot of grocery store owners. I think in person and coming to the store and trying to get the word out and asking for their feedback in person would be super helpful.
Yeah. And I'll just name again, shout out to our climate justice ambassadors. Nana is a member of that crew of young people who are part of the Office of Sustainability's and, intentionality around this, around getting, boots on the ground, particularly in the voices of our young people who are inheriting this climate crisis. And so really grateful for Nana and the other folks in the crew who are interested in being part of those conversations and bringing that information to neighborhoods. I wonder if maybe we can have one additional comment from Nupur Roy, if you're interested in sharing a thought or two before we wrap.
I'm actually an open designer at one, and I'm just sitting in taking notes for Travis.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Appreciate you. Well, Mary, would you like to say some closing words for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone for your time. I think, if there's any other, for many of you who have already participated, closing thoughts on kind of, what people think is sort of the most important things to make sure is advanced, or if there's anything you want to make sure doesn't happen. And also just wanted to add on, Celia, to your question earlier about kind of like community engagement. I think, you know, it's really important to be engaged right now in this process like you're doing, which is great, because like the whole point of getting input and feedback at this point in the process is so that the eventual recommendations and actions that come out of this plan address the concerns that you have and address the needs that you and others have. So that's exactly what we're trying to do tonight. So thank you for feedback. And if there's any additional feedback, you know, please don't hesitate to reach out. And as Natalie said, there'll be many additional opportunities for feedback in the coming months as well.
Thank you everyone so much for making the time. I know it's really hard to come out to public meetings, so I'm grateful to everyone. We've recorded this session and we'll have another one starting in about 45 minutes for another crew of people, or for you to continue the conversation if you want to join us for another 90 minutes.
And one final thing, James, if you could drop the link in the chat to our post-meeting survey, really helpful to get feedback from you about how you think this meeting went so that we can take that feedback into how we plan the next one.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao.